The wind across the high plains of Wyoming in the autumn of 1884 carried the first promise of a bitter winter. It was a thin, keening sound that scraped across the bleached grass and found the worn collar of Silas's coat. He had been riding for 3 days with no destination, a habit that had hardened into a way of life. The horse beneath him, a dun gelding as lean and enduring as himself, moved with a steady, ground-eating walk that asked for no guidance. They were two solitary figures in a landscape so vast it threatened to erase them. Silas was 40 years old, but the sun and the wind had carved deeper lines into his face than the years alone could account for. His eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, held a permanent squint, forever scanning a horizon that offered nothing new. He was a man in motion because to stop was to think, and to think was to remember the small plot of land in Ohio, the smell of turned earth, the sound of a woman's laugh, the weight of a small child in his arms. He had lost it all to a fever that had swept through his home like a prairie fire, leaving nothing but ash and silence. So he rode. He had been a farmer, a ranch hand, a scout, a drifter. He had been anything that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. The land here was honest in its cruelty. It was rock and dust and sagebrush, bleached pale as old bone under a relentless sun. It made no promises of softness or ease. It was a reflection of the landscape he carried inside him, and for that he felt a strange kinship with it. The desert doesn't lie. He topped a low rise and saw it, a small homestead huddled in a shallow basin, looking as if it had been dropped there by accident and had been trying to cling on ever since. The house was a simple clapboard structure, weathered to a defenseless gray. A barn leaned with the prevailing wind, but it was the fence that caught his eye. A long stretch of barbed wire lay slack and tangled on the ground. It was not the slow decay of neglect. The posts were snapped clean, the wire cut. It was the work of malice. He saw a figure moving near the downed fence. A woman. She worked with a grim, solitary purpose, trying to heave a broken post from the hard-packed earth. He watched her for a long moment. She was tall and moved with an ungraceful strength that spoke of necessity, not practice. Her shoulders were set, her focus absolute. He should have ridden on. It was not his trouble. His life was simpler for the lack of other people's trouble. But he did not ride on. There was something in the image, the lone woman, against the indifferent immensity of the plains, fighting a battle she was clearly losing, that snagged on a part of him he thought long dead. It was a quiet competence locked in a losing fight. He nudged the gelding forward, the creak of his saddle leather loud in the immense quiet. As he drew closer, he saw she was younger than he'd first thought. Perhaps 25. Her face was plain and serious, smudged with dirt. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe knot that had begun to fray. She stopped her work as he approached, her hand resting on the splintered post. She did not look afraid, only weary. Her eyes, he noticed, were a deep, clear gray, and they were taking his measure with a startling directness. They were taking stock eyes. "Fence is down," he said. It was a stupid thing to say, a fact laid bare. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "It is." "Looks deliberate." "It was," she said. Her voice was low and carried no trace of self-pity. From behind the house a boy of about 10 appeared, his face a smaller, softer version of the woman's. He stood, half hidden by the corner of the porch, watching Silas with wide, uncertain eyes. Silas dismounted, the stiffness in his joints a familiar complaint. He walked to the fence line, his risoled boots crunching on the dry soil. He ran a gloved hand over the cut wire. It was a clean snip. He looked at the splintered post, then back at the woman. You can't set a new post in this ground alone, not before the freeze. She knew it. He could see the knowledge in the slight tightening of her jaw. I'm aware. He had given himself an opening to leave. He had stated the facts, and the facts were grim. He could tip his hat, mount his horse, and be gone. He could be a mile away before the sun touched the western hills, her hopeless struggle already fading behind him. He looked at her hands, raw at the knuckles, the nails broken. He looked at the boy watching from the porch. He looked at the vast, empty land that surrounded them, a predator waiting for weakness. "I can help," he said. The words felt foreign in his own mouth. She considered him for a long moment. He could see the calculus in her steady gaze. He was a stranger, a drifter, but her options were few, and the cold was coming. "I can't pay you much." "A meal and a place for my horse is enough," he said. "We can start now. We're losing the light." She gave a single decisive nod. "My name is Elspeth Barlow. This is my brother Thomas." "Silas," he said. He did not offer a last name. He had not used it in years. They worked in a shared, practical silence. Silas retrieved his post-hole digger and a small axe from his pack. He showed her how to brace the new posts while he dug, his movements economical and sure. He had built miles of fence in his life. He knew its rhythms, the particular language of wire and wood. Elspeth was a quick study. She listened to his quiet instructions and followed them without question. She did not complain. She did not fill the silence with needless talk. She simply worked. Her presence, a steady, resilient force beside him. He found himself observing the small things. The way she coiled the loose wire with an efficient wrap of her wrist. The focused line of her brow as she held a post steady against his tamping. She was not beaten, just worn thin. As dusk began to purple the edges of the sky, they had 3 new posts set. The work was slow and brutal. The ground was hard, fighting them for every inch. "That's enough for today," Silas said, his breath pluming in the cooling air. She straightened up, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of a dirty glove. Color had come into her face from the work, like a lamp being turned up slowly. "Supper will be ready soon. You can put your horse in the barn. There's hay." He nodded. The meal was simple. Stew, thin but hot, and day-old bread. They ate at a small, scrubbed pine table in the kitchen. The room was sparse but clean. A fire in the cast-iron stove fought a losing battle against the drafts that crept through the walls. Thomas, the boy, sat between them, his earlier apprehension replaced by a quiet curiosity. He watched Silas eat, mimicking the way he held his spoon. "The land belonged to you?" Silas asked, breaking the silence. "It was my parents'," Elspeth said, her gaze fixed on her bowl. "They passed last winter. The fever." The word hung in the air between them. Silas felt a familiar coldness seep into his chest. He said nothing. He knew there was nothing to say. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house. "There's a note on the place," she continued, her voice flat. "Held by a man in town. Jedediah Finch." Silas knew the type, a man who circled failing homesteads like a vulture. "He's the one who cut the wire." She nodded. "He wants the land. Says it's no place for a woman and a boy. Says we should sell for what he's offering and move to town. And you won't." It wasn't a question. "This is our home," she said. It was a simple declaration, but it held the weight of an oath. He looked at her then, at the stubborn set of her chin, the quiet integrity in her eyes. He had seen men with more resources and less courage fold under far less pressure. In that moment, he saw her not as a woman in need of rescue, but as a person of unyielding substance. He had planned to leave in the morning. One meal, one night's shelter, and then back to the endless road. But the thought of riding away, of leaving her to this quiet, desperate fight, felt like a kind of betrayal. He had stumbled into a place where a good man was needed. He hadn't considered himself a good man in a long time. But he was a capable one. "The roof on your barn needs patching," he said, his voice rough. And that back door needs rehanging. I could stay on a few days, for wages if you can spare it, or for my keep." Elspeth looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. She studied his face, her gray eyes searching for something he couldn't name. He met her gaze without flinching. He was offering a practical solution to a practical problem. That was all, but it felt like more. "My keep would be fine," she said softly. It was a contract, unwritten, unspoken, but binding. He had made a commitment. He had stopped. The days that followed fell into a steady rhythm. They rose before the sun, the air sharp and cold in their lungs. They worked. The fence was the first task. They spent 3 days stretching and securing the wire until the boundary of her land was once more defined. A thin, sharp line drawn against the encroaching wilderness and the greed of men. The work was hard, but it was honest. Every taut wire, every solid post was a small victory. After the fence, they moved to the other tasks. Silas, with his quiet competence, seemed to know the cure for every ailment the small ranch suffered. He resoled Elspeth's worn boots with saddle leather and wire, a rough but durable fix. He climbed onto the roof of the barn and, with tar and salvaged shingles, patched the holes that had let in the rain and snow. He rehung the kitchen door so it closed snug in its frame, shutting out the insistent wind. Elspeth worked alongside him. She handed him tools, held ladders, learned to mix the tar. She did not defer to him, but worked with him, a partner in the reclamation of her own home. He learned that her quietness was not timidity, but a careful economy of self. She did not waste words, or energy, or hope. She invested them where they would do the most good. Respect grew between them, silent and solid, as a stone wall. It was built not on conversation, but on the shared language of labor. He respected the uncomplaining strength in her. She respected the steady capability of his hands. He would watch her in the evenings, mending clothes for her brother by the light of a single kerosene lamp, her fingers deft and sure. She would watch him in the yard, his movements deliberate as he sharpened an axe or mended a piece of harness, his focus so complete it seemed to hold the world at bay. The evenings were when the silence softened. After Thomas was asleep, they would sit at the kitchen table, a pot of weak coffee between them. It was in these quiet moments that the pieces of their pasts were offered up, small and carefully chosen. He learned that her parents had come from the East with high hopes, believing in the promise of the land. They had poured their lives into it, only to be broken by it. She spoke of them with a love that was clear-eyed and unsentimental. She learned that his wife's name had been Anna, that his daughter, Lily, had had hair the color of corn silk. He did not tell her the story of their deaths. He only offered their names, like placing 2 smooth stones on the table between them. She accepted them with a quiet nod, understanding that the names themselves were a confession of a grief too large to speak. "You were a farmer," she stated one night, watching him clean his tools. "I was," he said. "Good land, back in Ohio. Had a way with it." "Why did you leave?" she asked softly. He stopped his work, his hands still. He looked out the small window, into the impenetrable dark. "You can't farm land that's turned into a graveyard." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a shared understanding of loss. She did not offer sympathy. She offered something better, the dignity of her quiet presence. Their connection deepened in small, unspoken gestures. One morning, he found a pair of mended gloves on the porch rail, the torn seam stitched with thick, strong thread. He had not mentioned the tear. Another day, he was working on the far side of the property, and she walked the half-mile to bring him a canteen of fresh water, setting it down beside him without a word, before walking back. One evening, as they were finishing supper, Thomas fell asleep, his head pillowed on his arms, at the table. Elspeth moved to wake him, but Silas held up a hand. He rose, and with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, he lifted the boy into his arms. Thomas stirred but didn't wake, settling against Silas's shoulder. Silas carried him to his small room and laid him in his bed, pulling the quilt up to his chin. When he returned to the kitchen, Elspeth was standing by the stove, watching him. Her face was still, but her eyes held a profound and vulnerable light. In that shared look, over the form of the sleeping child, a conversation took place that neither of them could have put into words. It was about fatherhood and loss and the unexpected possibility of a new beginning. He saw in her eyes that she was not just seeing a hired hand, she was seeing the man he had been and the man he might yet become. He had been there for 3 weeks. He was no longer a drifter passing through. He was a man who lived on the Barlow homestead. The place was changing under their combined efforts. The house stood a little straighter. The fences were tight. There was an order and a purpose to the days that had been absent before. The landscape outside was still vast and unforgiving, but inside the perimeter of the ranch, they had built a small, fragile pocket of hope. The arrival of Jedediah Finch shattered that peace. He came in a polished black buggy, a vehicle of startling newness in the worn landscape. Finch himself was a man who seemed lacquered. His suit was a prosperous black, his boots shone, and his face had the soft, plump look of a man who did no physical labor. He oozed a false hardiness that did not reach his eyes. They were small and sharp, the eyes of a predator. He pulled up before the house and stepped down, surveying the recent repairs with a look of acquisitive approval. "Well, well, Miss Barlow," he boomed, his voice too loud for the quiet air. "It seems you've been busy." Elspeth came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Silas, who had been splitting wood near the barn, stopped his work but did not move closer. He stood by the woodpile, the axe held loosely in one hand, watching. "Mr. Finch," Elspeth said, her voice even. "I see you've made some improvements," Finch said, gesturing with a dismissive wave. "A good decision. Protects my investment." He smiled, but it was a cold, unpleasant thing. He let his gaze drift to Silas. "And you've acquired some help. A man of all work, is he?" The question was aimed at Elspeth, but his eyes were on Silas, cataloging the worn clothes, the lean, hard frame. He saw a drifter, a piece of transient labor. "Silas is helping me," Elspeth said simply. Finch stepped onto the porch, moving into her space. He was shorter than her, but he used his bulk to try and intimidate. "A commendable effort, my dear. Truly. But this is still no life for a lady. This land is hard. It requires a man's hand to run it properly, a man with capital." "I'm managing," she said, her back straight as a fence post. "For now," Finch said, his voice dropping to a confidential, wheedling tone. "But winter is coming. The note is due in the spring. My offer is still on the table. It's a generous one. Enough for you and the boy to get a small room in town. I could even help you find work. Seamstress, perhaps." He reached out and placed a hand on her arm, his touch both familiar and proprietary. It was a gesture of ownership. Silas saw it. He saw the flicker of revulsion in Elspeth's eyes before she masked it. He saw the condescending smile on Finch's face, and in that instant, the quiet neutrality he had cultivated for years burned away. He set the axe down, the sound of the metal head against the wood a sharp crack in the silence. He walked toward the porch. He did not hurry. His steps were deliberate, measured. He did not look at Finch. He looked at Elspeth. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his presence suddenly filling the space. Finch's hand was still on Elspeth's arm. Silas raised his eyes and looked at the banker. His face was calm, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were as hard and cold as river stones. "That's far enough," Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, quiet rumble, but it held an absolute, unshakable authority. It was the voice of a man who had been pushed to his limit and had chosen his ground. Finch, startled, snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He was a man who dealt in paper and intimidation, and he was not accustomed to this kind of quiet, physical certainty. He looked from Silas's impassive face to Elspeth's, and saw not a hired hand and a desperate woman, but a united front. "I am merely having a business discussion with Miss Barlow," Finch blustered, trying to regain his footing. Silas took one step up onto the porch, placing himself slightly in front of Elspeth. He had not touched Finch. He had not raised his voice. But he had become a barrier. "Your business is concluded for today." Finch's face mottled with anger. He was used to being obeyed. "You have no say in this, Drifter. When I foreclose on this property, you will be the first to go." "The note is not due until spring," Silas said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "You'll conduct your business then. Or you'll conduct it through me." The threat was unspoken, but it hung in the air, more potent than any shout. Finch looked at the man before him, the worn clothes, the capable hands, the eyes that had seen too much to be easily frightened. He saw a man who had nothing to lose, and such men were dangerous. Finch sputtered, his bravado deflating. "This is not over, Miss Barlow. You're making a grave mistake." He turned, stomped down the steps, and climbed back into his shiny buggy. He whipped the reins, and the buggy lurched away, leaving a cloud of dust and a ringing silence. Silas did not watch him go. He turned to Elspeth. Her face was pale, but her eyes were luminous. She was looking at him with an expression of dawning wonder. He had not acted like a hired hand. He had acted like a husband. As he had defended her honor and her home, he had stood his ground. He had stood for her. He felt a flush of heat rise in his own neck. He had not intended to make such a stand. It had been an instinct, a reflex. He had simply seen a threat to her, and he had moved to stop it. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward and exposed. "The wood needs splitting," he said, turning to go back to the wood pile. "Silas," she said, her voice soft. He stopped but did not turn around. "Thank you." He gave a short nod and walked away, picking up his axe. But the simple rhythm of the work could not quiet his mind. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed. He was no longer just helping. He was protecting. He was involved. The thought was both terrifying and strangely welcome. It felt like the first thaw after a long, hard freeze. The days after Finch's visit were different. A new awareness existed between them, a tension that was not unpleasant. The quiet of their evenings was now charged with unspoken things. The work continued, the rhythm of their days unchanged. But underneath it, a new foundation was settling. They were no longer just two people sharing a space. They were allies, partners. Thomas, with the simple clarity of a child, was the one who gave it a name. He had started following Silas around, handing him tools and asking endless questions. He had taken to calling him by his name, no longer the wary, silent observer. Silas found himself answering the boy's questions about horses and tools, his voice patient. He was teaching the boy things, the way a father would. One afternoon, Silas was in the barn, mending a leather harness that had split. The smell of leather and hay was thick in the air. He worked with his head down, his hands moving with practiced skill, stitching the thick hide with an awl and waxed thread. He heard a soft footstep on the packed earth of the barn floor. It was Elspeth. She stood in the wide doorway, silhouetted against the bright, cold afternoon. She held a steaming mug in her hands. She walked over and set it down on a crate near him. Coffee. He nodded his thanks, not looking up from his work. He could feel her watching him. The silence stretched, filled only by the scrape of the awl and the whisper of the wind around the corners of the barn. He finished a stitch and pulled it tight. He knew she had not come just to bring him coffee. "Thomas has been talking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas kept his eyes on the harness. "He's a good boy, curious. He asked me a question this morning," she continued, her voice hesitant. "He asked if you were going to be his new pa." Silas's hands went still. The awl rested against the leather. He felt his heart give a slow, heavy thud in his chest. He did not know what to say. He had not allowed himself to think that far ahead. He had been living one day at a time, focused on the task at hand, the fence, The roof, the harness, it was simpler that way. He finally looked up at her. She stood straight and tall, her hands clasped in front of her. There was a vulnerability in her face he had never seen before, a fragile hope that was terrifying to behold. She was laying her life, and her brother's life, before him. Her gaze dropped to the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "My brother said you were looking for a wife." The words hung in the dusty air of the barn. It was not an accusation. It was a question. It was an offering. It was the bravest thing he had ever heard. She was giving him a way out, framing the question as her brother's, but they both knew it was hers. She was asking him his intentions. She was asking him if he was just passing through, or if he was building something. Silas put the harness down. He rose slowly to his feet, his joints protesting. He stood before her close enough to see the faint pulse beating in her throat. He thought of his years of wandering, of the emptiness that had been his only companion. He thought of the cold bedroll and the solitary campfires. He had been a man running from a ghost, but here, in this run-down homestead with this plain, courageous woman, the ghost had finally grown quiet. He had not been looking for a wife. He had been done with that part of his life. He had been done with living. But life, it seemed, was not done with him. He looked into her clear, steady eyes. He saw the woman who worked without complaint, who faced down bullies and hardship with a quiet, unyielding spine. He saw the woman who had mended his gloves and brought him water. He saw the woman who had trusted a stranger. He saw a home. He reached out and gently touched her cheek with the back of his calloused fingers. Color came into her face slowly, like a lamp being turned up. "I've already found her," he said. The words were simple, a declaration of fact, but they held the weight of a vow. A shaky breath escaped her. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He wiped it away with his thumb. "Finch will be back in the spring," he said, his voice practical, grounding them both. "He will try to take this place. I have some money saved. Not much, but it's been earning interest in a bank in Cheyenne for 10 years. It might be enough to settle the note." He was not offering poetry. He was offering a plan. He was offering a partnership. "I am asking you to be my wife, Elspeth," he said formally, "to join my name to yours, to make this place ours legally, to raise your brother as my own son, to build a life here, together." She searched his face, and what she saw there must have been enough. The earnestness, the honesty, the promise of a steady, capable love. She did not weep or fall into his arms. Her answer was as practical and as profound as his offer. She took a deep breath and gave him a single, certain nod. "Yes," she said, "I'd want that." 2 years later, the Wyoming landscape was still vast, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like a backdrop. It was spring, and the high plains were alive with a fragile, tenacious green. The homestead in the shallow basin no longer looked like it was clinging to life. It looked like it was thriving. The house had a new coat of white paint, a startling beacon of order in the wild land. The fences Silas and Elspeth had mended were now part of a larger network of strong, tight wire that enclosed a growing herd of cattle. The barn no longer leaned. It stood straight and tall, its roof sound, its stalls filled with healthy livestock. The vegetable garden by the house was neat and productive. Silas and Elspeth were married a month after his proposal, a simple ceremony before a justice of the peace in a town 50 miles away, deliberately avoiding Finch's sphere of influence. With Silas's savings, they had confronted the banker and paid the note on the land in full. The look on Finch's face, a mixture of shock and thwarted greed, had been a quiet, satisfying victory. They stood together on the porch Silas had rebuilt, watching the sun set. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new life. Elspeth was no longer the worn, weary woman he had first met. A softness had come into her face. Her hands were still calloused from work, but they were no longer raw. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, a comfortable, familiar weight. Thomas, now a boy of 12, was out in the pasture with the new colt, his laughter carrying on the evening air. He was a happy, confident boy, secure in the love of the two people who were his world. Inside the house, a new sound had joined the quiet rhythm of their lives. The soft cry of a baby. Their daughter, born 6 months ago. They had named her Anna. Silas held his wife closer, his arm wrapped securely around her. He looked out at the land. Their land. He remembered the man he had been, the empty shell riding toward nowhere. He had arrived here with nothing but a tired horse and a past he could not outrun. He had been looking for a place to disappear. Instead, he had found a place to belong. He had found a reason to stop. Elspeth shifted, turning her face up to his. Her gray eyes, still as clear and direct as the day he met her, held a deep, quiet contentment. She did not need to speak. He could read her thoughts as easily as his own. They were both remembering. The broken fence, the shared meal, the quiet vow in the dusty barn. He had thought his heart was a piece of fallow ground, a place where nothing would ever grow again. But this woman, with her quiet strength and her unyielding courage, had planted a seed, and together with their own 2 hands, they had cultivated a life. There is a kind of courage that is not loud. It is the quiet determination to mend a broken fence when the whole world seems to be pushing it down. It is the bravery to offer a meal to a stranger, to trust when you have every reason not to. It is the strength to stand between a bully and the person you have chosen to protect. The greatest things in this world are not found. They are built. A home is not a place you stumble upon. It is a structure you erect, board by board, with someone who sees the solid foundation of your character. Love is not a sudden fire. It is the slow, steady warmth of a hearth you tend to together, day after day. It is found in the shared silence of hard work, in the unspoken promise of a mended glove, in the quiet declaration that you have already found what you did not even know you were searching for. It is the simple, profound act of stopping and building a life where you stand,